Welcome to the official launch event for Rita McGrath's new book, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. KPMG is proud to host this event with Rita here at the Strategy Forum in Helsinki, Finland, where she has been our keynote speaker. After I introduce Rita, she will speak for about 10 minutes about strategic inflection points and the other big ideas in her book. And then we'll open it up to the Q&A. And you can enter your questions in through a Zoom chat. And we will get to as many of them as we can. If we run out of time, then Rita will answer the questions on her website, ritamcgrath.com. For those of you who don't know Rita, she is a professor at the Columbia Business School. She's a popular speaker and a consultant to organizations all over the world. She's won many prestigious accolades, including the #1 award in strategy from Thinkers 50, a global management ranking. Well, since we don't have much time, let's turn it over to Rita and
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, KPMG, for graciously hosting this event. It's a real thrill for me. It's a day that's been long in coming to launch the book into the world, and here it is. Isn't it beautiful? So just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be recording the session, so for those of you that didn't make this time work for whatever reason, we can send you a recording afterwards. Please do feel free to tweet or otherwise post on social media. The hashtag is #SeeingAroundCorners, and we'll pick that up very soon. And finally, if you have questions, and I hope you do, you can enter them in the Q&A box in the Zoom function, or you can enter them into the chat. And Sarah is going to try to gather them up, and we'll have a more interactive discussion during the latter part of this webinar. So what this book is about is really the intersection of a new way of thinking about strategy with the critical component of timing added in. And those of you that know my work know that for some time now I've been reflecting on how our views of what strategy is and how we should be thinking about it really need to change as we see these massive changes wrought by new technologies, by different factors in the environment. The pace of change is getting faster, the length of a typical competitive advantage is getting shorter. We've seen brand new companies less than 10 years old taking over entire sectors of the economy. So there's a lot of change out there. And in my previous book, I talked a lot about the new strategy playbook and what we need to think about to understand what it means for strategy when advantages last for a shorter period of time. So this book really builds on that set of ideas with saying, well, when do you know? And there's good news here and not so good news. So the good news is a strategic inflection point feels as though it happens overnight, but it really doesn't. They usually take quite a long time to emerge into the world. And in fact, the inspiration for this thought came from Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, in which one character asks another, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the response was, well, gradually. And then suddenly. And that's really the case with strategic inflection points. The seeds of them are born long before it arrives on your doorstep fully fledged. Now, if you get on the right side of one, it can take your business to new heights. If you miss it, it can cause a big problem. So what I'd like to do in this talk is really go beyond the book, on the assumption those of you that have logged in will be picking up the book at some stage, I would hope, but to talk about inflection points more broadly in terms of how we see them in real life. And so the first one that I'd like to focus on is the emerging possibilities created by a whole class of communication and connection technologies that have completely changed how business can be done, what's economical to do, what's affordable to do. So I define a strategic inflection point as a moment in time in which the fundamental assumptions underlying a business or an organization's activities really change. And it's a function of changing what's possible, changing what the constraints are, changing something, typically in the environment that really renders the past almost irrelevant and creates new challenges for the future. So the first class of competitors in this emerging world that I'm going to focus on were really enabled by these new digital companies. So YouTube, Facebook, Google, Amazon Web Services, which have really made the competitive structure needed to communicate and to put together the back office of a business very, very inexpensive and very, very quick. So if you go into the past, if you wanted to get a message to 1 billion human beings, you had to be a media empire. If you wanted to post a video for hundreds of thousands of people to see, you had to be a movie studio. And what we're seeing now is it's really all about access to assets rather than ownership of assets, which is one of the key trends that we're beginning to see in the world. So classes of competitors that are taking advantage of this would be companies like Dollar Shave Club, basically totally undercutting the traditional model of men's grooming and causing storied companies like Procter & Gamble that have taken decades to build up their competitive advantages to suddenly realize overnight those things have really changed. I would argue also we're seeing a real shift in what we've commonly thought of as business-to-business businesses made possible by these new business models. I would go so far as to say even a business-to-business business is now being forced to deal with its customers the way business-to-consumer customers have traditionally been managed. So if you think about an established firm like Caterpillar, for example, they're being asked to lease their equipment and to offer it on a variable rate service with levels of service that previously might have been reserved for consumer-type companies. So we're seeing it really as a sea change in how even business-to-business companies are doing. You can see the effect on Procter & Gamble of the entrance of these startups, Dollar Shave Club and Harry's and companies like that, really undermining the traditional retail model. So I think that's an example of the kind of inflection points that I write about in the book. The big change is that our new technologies have made accessing assets rather than owning assets possible. And we're now seeing this sort of bleeding out all over in the economy. You don't have to own clothing anymore, you can rent it. You don't have to own a car, you can just hail a service. You don't have to actually hire employees, you can get them sort of on the open market. And what this is doing is introducing market competition into more and more parts of the economy that used to require owning things, that used to require belonging to things. So I think that is a real change in our assumptions about what it takes to go into business. So it's facilitated whole categories of startups that are taking advantage of these phenomena in the light of competitors changing. So another change that I think is really shifting has to do with this marketization of the economy. And, the storied line about human resources was always, human resources wants a seat at the table. Well, what's happening now is human resources is going to be forced to take a seat at the table because people are becoming one of the last sources of enduring competitive advantage. So how do you manage a tour of duty workforce where, you've got to have as compelling a value proposition for your employees as you do for your customers? How do we deal with the fact that we know diverse thinking is better performing than thinking that's really homogenous? And it's not enough just to bring people in as diverse candidates. They have to be included. And that's a whole level of challenge that has been really, really difficult. So those kinds of issues are now making their way into what's expected of our human resource talent. So really important part of competitive advantage now being sort of in the staff functions of a typical organization. Then we have a sea change in my business, which is education. And what we're bumping up against is the limits of traditional education to do well by the people that invest in it, the people being educated, and the people that are trying to hire those going through the educational system. And we've got a number of factors that are really putting pressure on that system. The first is that we've got rampant degree inflation. So jobs that 25 years ago wouldn't have required, say, a bachelor's degree now require it. We've got students taking on enormous amounts of student debt, without often having something to really show for it. And we've got people whose degrees are only vaguely related to the jobs that they want to have. And then underlying all of that is the need to continuously reskill, upskill, redevelop our talent, because if you got a degree 10 years ago, that doesn't mean it's relevant to the challenges of tomorrow. So I see huge pressures on the educational establishment, and a couple of ideas about what we can expect to see more of are, I think we're going to start to see credentials, but credentials that don't reflect a degree, but credentials that reflect a skill. So more credentialing at the level of what you can do rather than where you sat for 4 years. We're also starting to see really innovative new program designs. And an example of this would be something IBM sponsored and other companies are now joining, which is a thing called PTech, Pathways to Technology. And essentially it's a combined high school and 2-year associate's degree. And when people come out of that program, which lasts for 6 years, they have both their high school degree, but they've also got a qualification which allows them to go straight into high-tech employment, should that be their goal, or they can go on to get a more advanced 4-year degree if they want to do that. So we're seeing the development of alternative pathways, which I think are going to change the conversation between employers and employees and what people expect to have. Another big inflection point that I've been talking about for a long time has to do with this increasing division between the benefits that investors and executives and shareholders are getting from the productivity improvements of business and the portion that's going toward widely shared prosperity. And I think what we're seeing now is the beginning of a recognition that perhaps we've gone too far on that balance, that perhaps the balance is way over on the side of investors and executives and not enough to create sort of shared demand and shared prosperity. The chart you're seeing here was created by my friend William Lazonick, who's been talking about this a lot. And I think the Business Roundtable's acknowledgement that perhaps we need to be considering multiple shareholders is a recognition that this inflection point is perhaps long overdue. So those are some examples of the kind of thinking that I think goes into our inflection point kind of world. So I'll close the formal portion of my remarks with the observation that, when I started in strategy years ago, strategy was kind of over there, and it was all about industries and industry competition, and innovation was, in a corner, sort of huddled for warmth. And what we're seeing now is those two things really coming together. And on top of that, what we're now understanding is that, you can't think of innovation these days without some digital component, some technological component. And I know that's very well aligned with what KPMG has been working on with its clients. So I think that's a really important point to be reflecting on. Last thing is, if you want to see an inflection point, the place to start is thinking about where you go to reach the edges of your organization. The way I describe it in the book is snow melts, but it melts from the edges. It doesn't present itself neatly at headquarters for you to analyze. So think about, how can I get out to the edges? How could I be there where the future is starting to make itself manifest so that I take the time it takes to grapple with an inflection point before I get caught on the wrong end of it? So thank you very much for visiting with us, and I hope we have some questions and time for some discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rita, for telling us about the ideas in your book. We are starting to get some questions coming in. Please put some more in there so we can continue the discussion. One interesting question that came from Deborah is that who inside the organization owns the art of or practice of seeing around corners?
Yeah, that is a great question, because nobody does. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, it's on the CEO's desk, but there's a lot of stuff on the CEO's desk. So I think it's hard to leave it to just that person. I do think those leadership roles, those key leadership roles, need to make it clear they're interested. So you need to be curious, you need to be open. One of the most important things for a leader is to be open to hearing uncomfortable news, even if it's not what you wanted to hear, to be open to that. I would say at the end of the day, it has to be at the top of the house where that is the ownership that rests, but they can't actually do that work. Now here's the interesting thing. When you ask in an organization after something has come and gone, and it's obvious to everybody this was a disaster, there are always people who saw it. Always people who saw it. My favorite example is an old one now, but it's of my dad, who had been at Xerox subsequently went to Kodak, sitting across the desk from the guy who's the emulsion research laboratory head, at Kodak. I mean, this is a guy who's been in silver halide and stuff, and you stick him in the arm, that's what he would bleed, and it was all about chemicals and everything. But my dad had seen the digital future and said very plainly, well, sure, it's going to go digital, and 8 millimeter film has had it, and this is where it's going to go. And the head of the research lab's kind of going, no, that's not a world I particularly want to be part of. So I think part of the ownership and governance of this is someone in the organization, typically it's someone in the upper middle ranks, has to be willing to hear those messages, has to be willing to see those people and listen for what they could be thinking. Because if you think about it, it's the technical people, it's the people on the front lines, it's the people talking to your customers. Those are the ones that are going to see it first because they're most exposed to it.
This was really an interesting point when I was reading your book over the weekend, that absolutely the people that are closest to the front lines are the ones that are going to be having the most information. So it's about creating channels to make sure that information gets up to the top.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for the top to be willing to hear it.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the problems, right, is if you're at the top of a big organization, chances are you've spent most of your life keeping the wheels turning. You may have had a varied career with lots of different experiences, but if the core business was the same core business, even though you were in multiple countries or perhaps at multiple levels, and someone comes along and says, guess what, this digital stuff is going to make everything you ever did in your life obsolete, that's a hard lesson to hear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's take another question from some of our listeners here. Tracy Zimmerman asks, what's the most surprising thing you found as you researched and prepared for your book?
I think the first really surprising thing was how long these things take. If you think about something like the internet, e-commerce revolution, right? I mean, from the first time the internet became something ordinary people got exposed to, well, if you think about it, it took, 20, 30 years before the internet became something ordinary people got exposed to. And from then, which I would trace to sort of 94, 95, I mean, it's been a quarter of a century to get to now when it's become a fact of daily life. So I think the first big surprise was how long things take. But the good news is you've got time. If you get on it early, you've got time. I think the second thing that was very interesting to me was that a lot of times companies can position themselves for an emerging inflection point without having to make a gigantic, huge, humongous investment. I think that's one of the myths that's come up, which is, you have to bet big and you have to be in there really early. And my research suggests not. And a great example of this would be Nike. And we all know Nike, very fabulous competitor. But they began effectively preparing for what's become the direct-to-consumer internet revolution years and years ago with their very first kind of Apple, iPod, Nike running products. I mean, those are a little hokey now, but when you look back on it, those were the very first early forays of going direct-to-consumer. And today that represents about 29% of their sales, that channel. So even though Nike's still very strong in its traditional channels, because they started to make those investments early, they were able to, get more comfortable with it. They've got people who now know how to do it. They've built up the capability. Took a long time. Took a long time.
What do you think is the danger of reacting too fast and too quickly?
Well, I think the biggest risk is you make a move that's directionally correct, and yet the ecosystem isn't ready. So I think go back to the internet would be a great example. I mean, some of you will remember the whole .com revolution, and we were all going to be sitting in our garages, and everything was going to be delivered to us overnight. Which is actually, true, that was a correct vision. But in the early days of e-commerce, 20%, 40% of households even had home computers. You got onto the internet by dial-up. Everybody was under the impression that it was going to be the portals, the Yahoos of the world that were going to run the world. We didn't know about search engines. We didn't know about modified search. Amazon was still just selling its own product. And there was lots of missing pieces to that ecosystem. So what ends up happening is everybody pours money into it. You may remember the .com bubble, right? We had Pets.com and Webvan and all those early internet companies. And what they didn't realize is that to create a complete customer experience was going to take a lot more bits and pieces, and it wasn't ready yet. So the first challenge I see is people move very early and very aggressively, and then, things aren't ready yet. We see this a lot right now with a lot of these digital transformation programs. So companies as varied as the BBC to, telecom companies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on digital transformation without really thinking through what don't we know? Because you can't do a digital transformation as though you were just implementing a, Six Sigma program. There's a lot that still is unknown about it, and you have to do it sort of steadily, step by step, without making a huge, big upfront commitment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's take another one from the audience here. What are the top qualities needed to be able to become a master of reading both the gradual and sudden elements of timing and innovation and strategy?
Whoa, that's a big one.
How do you do it?
How do you do it? I think the first thing you need to do is make the time for it. We're all super busy. We're all, much more distracted perhaps than historically people had been. So just clearing your calendar, clearing your mind to be able to make the time for it. I think that's the first thing. I mean, that's not a particularly skillful thing, but if you look at people that get caught by surprise, inevitably they're paying attention to something else. So I think making the time for it. Secondly, I think really getting out to the edges and not resisting what you learn there is really important. So here's a thought experiment. If you want to know what 20-year-olds 10 years from now are going to be thinking, well, guess what? They're all alive and here today, and they're all 10. So, when was the last time you went and had a conversation with a 10-year-old? I think getting beyond your own industry, sector, function, country, those things are really, really important. And in fact, I think this is starting to be reflected in people's career trajectories now. There was a study done by Korn Ferry in partnership with LinkedIn. And the great thing about LinkedIn is you have lots of data on people's careers. And they were very interested in learning who actually rose to C-level positions. And what they found was very different than what a lot of people expect. A lot of our expectations are that we're going to have this linear career. It's going to be beautifully planned, and we're going to go right from getting our advanced degree to getting the first job, the net, And instead what they found was the people that really ascended to the most senior roles have these zigzags, right? So I might have been in sales and then I went into compliance. And maybe I was in compliance for a while and then I went into operations. And it's this sort of ability to expand your personal, call them almost receptors to what's going on out there, that these zigzaggy careers give you. And so I think that's really interesting because boards are now picking people with those kinds of backgrounds because I think whether explicitly or implicitly they realize it's that diversity of experience that's going to allow you to sort of see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. That diversity is a very interesting point because then you have both diversity in terms of the composition of a board with different backgrounds, but actually diversity within one person who has experienced multiple different things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you've never experienced anything and you look at it, how would you know what it meant?
Exactly. So we have a question from I believe it was Robert Wright about assumptions. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this is really based on the assumptions that we have. Yet most often we actually don't talk about the assumptions that we have. How do you bring that to light?
So this is a near and dear topic to my heart. Thank you for the question. So one big change, I'd say, since I first started working on the whole notion of how we manage assumptions, this would have been back in the 90s. And at the time I observed that when you're going into something that's new to you, your ratio of assumptions you have to make relative to knowledge that you have becomes very high. And the problem with that is human beings are really bad at managing assumptions. We tend to forget them, or we turn them in our minds into reality. And that used to apply to the world of the new, the world of innovation, the world of corporate venturing, things that were different, the world of startups. And in the intervening period, we've learned a lot about how you narrow down assumptions in those worlds. So things like managing by checkpoints, managing through pivots, being agile, doing experimentation. And I think there's a pretty big recognition now that that's very suitable for the world of starting things new. Here's where I think we're now in uncharted territory, which is as you look at entire sectors of the economy, our core businesses are starting to experience the same level of assumptions relative to knowledge that our existing businesses, that our new businesses used to have, rather. So we've got core businesses sort of being shoved into this much more uncertain space. And that leaves a lot of people unequipped. because they've never had to do that, you know. And so a lot of the skills that people who are doing innovative things developed now have to come back and be used in the core business. So if you look at, just take Procter & Gamble, for example, they've had to learn very quickly how to build a direct-to-consumer offering. If you look at other companies whose core businesses are being attacked by digital upstarts of various kinds, they've had to really build out new capability very fast. If you look at media right now, the whole issue of the streaming wars, right? So we've got Netflix and Disney and the other players all going into streaming subscriptions even as we speak, because they're suddenly realizing their old model isn't working as well anymore, and they don't want to be left out of whatever the next thing is. But it still requires an enormous, almost heroic level of making assumptions.
Wow. Another question from the audience here. How do the ideas in Seeing Around Corners relate to some of your previous works and the end of competitive advantage, and how should we see that?
Yeah, so I think it sort of follows an arc, right? I mean, I started, my first book was called The Entrepreneurial Mindset, and it asked the question back in the year 1999, what would a big company look like that behaved like an entrepreneur? And that was the first one. And then we had a series of books looking at, how do you find attractive new markets, and how do you plan when you've got a plan for growth under high uncertainty? And then End of Competitive Advantage was really a reflection on what does the world look like when advantages don't last, or you can't protect them, or you don't have moats, or you don't have barriers to entry. And after that book, a lot of people got very freaked out by it, which was interesting. But the big question was, when? How do you know? What are the telltale signs that it's time to take action? And that's really what the genesis of Seeing Around Corners was. It took a while to come together because this is a very tricky topic. Because, ironically, when you look at a company that's about to be facing an inflection point, oftentimes things are really good. They're producing great cash flow, the world around them seems very friendly, it doesn't look as though things are going to erode anytime soon, and yet all of a sudden they wake up one morning and they've lost 16% of their market share. And so I think it's tricky to be able to pin down exactly the timing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. We have another question from the audience here about noise pollution and how do you sort through the positive, and false and negatives, all of that, and really sort out what's happening?
Yeah, huge issue. And a couple of observations. You can make great decisions and still have a bad outcome. You can make horrible, terrible, awful decisions and still end up with a good outcome. I mean, luck is a part of strategy, right? And so I think one of the things that is important to think about is, how am I documenting what I know and then following it through? So I would say you don't start off with a weak signal and say that's the truth. What you start off is with a weak signal and you say, well, wait a minute. If that were to lead to something, what would I have to be able to observe? So it's almost like you're testing your way to some kind of answer and outcome. And that's when you need to give it the time, right? Because over time, the false positives will fade away, and the ones that actually can endure will stick in there. So you need to have almost an experimental mindset.
Interesting. Well, here's an interesting one for us as KPMG, actually. How can you tell us about consulting and how consulting should be seeing around corners? And are we being disrupted already?
Well, I think there's been some disruption already in historically what consultants did. I mean, historically,
Absolutely.
One of the reasons you hired consultants was because they had specialized knowledge you didn't, or access to specialized information, or access to specialized analytical techniques that you didn't have. And so I think historically that was one of the reasons why so many firms turned to consultants. Well, today information is so much more widely available, and what I'm seeing consulting do now, when it's the good ones, is synthesizing that information. So what does it all mean? What do the data points mean? If I have 100,000 elements of information, how do I know which ones are significant or not? So I think that's a big role for consultants. I think consultants still bring a level of specialized skill. There are a lot of companies who couldn't afford to hire the kind of people that would come to work at a firm like KPMG, just because they don't need a full-time person to do that, so you don't have, not all the time, exactly. So I think that's another thing. I do think we're going to see some disruption around the capability building part of consulting. So we talked earlier today about, clients don't want a nice report, they want results. And so I think what we'll start to see is more of consulting about really building client capability, and that could be a little bit disruptive to the core business. But I think if you're offering valuable synthesis and you're helping people with rare skills, there's always going to be a role for that.
Excellent. We do appreciate your view there.
I'm glad.
Absolutely. We're about out of time now, and so I want to thank Rita, and I want to thank our audience for listening in, and thank you, Rita, for telling us all about your book. It's really been an interesting journey to learn more about your research, and
thank you so much for spending your weekend with it. I didn't mean to put you through that. Anyway, it's here today, available wherever books are sold, and do follow me on Twitter. I'm at RG McGrath. The hashtag is Seeing Around Corners, and we'll look forward to the next chapter.